Well, sometimes the deepest insights come from the strangest places. 1980s pop sensations, Tears for Fears. Anyone? They wrote some big hits back in the day, and none bigger than Everybody Wants to Rule the World. And here's how some of it goes. It's my own design, it's my own remorse. Help me to decide, help me make the most of freedom and of pleasure. Nothing ever lasts forever. Everybody wants to rule the world. Now, when it comes to who should be in control, we all seem to have a lot of say about who should exercise the levers of control, don't we? If the last federal election didn't remind us of that. So should the government have most of the power, or should the people have most of the power? Or government by the people for the people? What is it to be? And if you're a small L liberal, then bigger government leads inevitably to better government and a fairer, more just society for all. But if you're a conservative, then bigger government is the bane of good society, never allowing people to be truly free. However, I think that when it boils down to it, humans simply want control over their own lives. Basically, they want the final decision about their life to rest with them, not anybody else. And in looking at King David in our series today, and if you remember at the start we said that the central narrative running through the Bible is that God is king. God is king. But as we look at King David's life, Tears for Fears are very biblical in their perspective. Everybody wants to rule the world, to exercise authority over the created order, at least their small patch of it. If not the world, then certainly their world. Now, why is that drive within us? Well, you might be surprised to know that the Bible says that God created humans to do exactly that, to rule the world. So my first point is this, that it's the role of every human being to rule. Back in the Bible's first book, the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings, God creates humans as the pinnacle or the high point of his creation. And he says this to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over it." Rule the world. That's what the capital R, ruler of the world, the creator God, commands his creatures. The desire to rule is a desire implanted in human beings by their creator. So would it surprise you then that the most referenced job description in the Bible is that of king? You might think that the Bible, being a book about God's words, would see the number one spot for a job title in the Bible being prophet, or because it's a religious book, priest. But it's actually king. And the king with the most focus in the Bible, outside of God, the one who's referenced time and time again, is King David, our subject for today. And we're going to look at our first clip in a moment from the Bible in the TV series, but a little bit of background before we look at it. God's people Israel, by the point of this clip, are living in the promised land, the land that was promised to Abraham, one of the guys we looked at a few weeks ago. Now, Israel, having been rescued from slavery by Moses, we also looked at Moses' life, start to fill the land. They start to subdue the land and have dominion over its people. They start to rule. But things then go pear-shaped. God has set up leaders and speakers for him to lead his people, but it's pretty much very mixed results. And eventually, the people, looking around them, seeing that there's chaos everywhere, even in Israel, and they clamour for a king to lead them. And the prophet leader at the time, Samuel, warns them that no good can come of it, and that God is to be their true king, their true ruler. But they have a king. They want a king. They're going to get a king. And their first king is King Saul. And while he starts off well, his primary problem is that he wants to rule the world his way, not God's way. Eventually, the enemies of Israel, the Philistines, start to subdue Israel. And battle lines are constantly drawn up, with Israel getting the worst end of the stick each time. And eventually in this battle we're going to look at, as Israel watches on and the two sides are facing off against each other, the Philistine champion, the giant Goliath, comes along. Who will be Israel's champion to fight against Goliath and win the day. No one that is, until the shepherd boy, David, steps forward. My daughter wanted to watch this series with me, and the amount of times I had to go cover her eyes up. But our reading puts it most clearly in lines 13 to 15. David says this, "All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." And David is the conduit, the way that God is going to do that. Here is David fulfilling the role that God intends humans to fulfill. And the high point of David's life is here, even prior to him becoming king. He does what humans were created to do, to rule and subdue. And he does it by serving and saving others, conquering evil, and living under the rule of the greatest king, the Lord. That is what humans are designed to do, according to the Bible. That is what God intends for the king of his people to do in a specific and obvious manner. Serve and save people, conquer evil, and acknowledge the Lord as the true king. Secondly, however, the role of every human is, in the biblical story, tragically twisted by the problem of every human. That's the second thing. We had the role of every human, the problem of every human. You see, humans want to rule without God in the story. And that's a story that also starts in Genesis, when humans decide that they want control without God. They want to make the most of freedom and of pleasure without God. And the tragic story and its tragic consequences of how our first human parents, Adam and Eve, come out from under God's rule and lead all humanity into rebellion against the capital R ruler, God, blights the rest of the story as you read it. And for all of his greatness, it blights King David too. And we had the start of that story read to us by Paul, didn't we? In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab. Ooh, isn't the king supposed to be leading his people into battle? And the devil makes work for idle hands. And what happens next is ugly, very ugly. Because once he finds out that Bathsheba is pregnant, he has to sort of get rid of the evidence, doesn't he? He cleans up his mess by organising Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, to be killed in battle. He then takes Bathsheba to be his wife. They have a son. No one is any the wiser. Except, of course, the true king. Because the first part of this story, which we don't have, ends this way. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. The most telling line by God's spokesman, Nathan, is this: a king is never above his God. Now, those words aren't recorded in the Bible, but Nathan does say this recorded in the Bible: "Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight?" Even King David, chosen by God to rule, still ruled, but he did it outside of the covering of God. And if we described the high point of David's life as serving and saving others, conquering evil, and living under the rule of the greater king, then here is undoubtedly the low point, isn't it? For when David's kingship is at its most powerful, light years away from being that humble shepherd boy, he does the opposite of what kings should do. Rather than serve others, he serves himself by taking Bathsheba. He then saves his own reputation by killing Uriah. He plans and executes evil rather than conquering it, refusing to acknowledge the rule of the greater king until Nathan comes in and has a go at him. And David is simply the template for all of humanity, according to the Bible story. And perhaps we're not as obvious or as tawdry as David, but self-serving, self-focused, and refusing to acknowledge the true king takes many guises. And once again, we cross to those pillars of late 20th century philosophical insight, Tears for Fears. 2 years before they wrote Everybody Wants to Rule the World, they had another monster hit called Mad World. Listen to its lyrics. All around me are familiar faces, worn out places, bright and early for their daily races, going nowhere, going nowhere. Their tears are filling up their glasses. No expression, no expression. Hide my head, I want to drown my sorrow. No tomorrow, no tomorrow. And I find it kind of funny and I find it kind of sad. The dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had. I find it hard to tell you, I find it hard to take. When people run in circles, it's a very, very mad world. Humans made to rule the world, running in circles, like King David, usurping the true ruler. And we will rule, and the result is often madness. What we need is someone made to rule the world, like David, who serves and saves people, conquers evil, and acknowledges the true ruler. In other words, if the role of every human is to rule, and the problem of every human is that they rule badly, the only solution is a human who will rule well. And the story of the Bible, which we're getting to as we go along this train track, it's inexorably coming, is that one was born to rule, as it says in the Christmas carol, once in royal David's city. And as an old Christian hymn puts it, this one who is born to rule is great David's greater son. And that is the Lord Jesus. I want to keep some of the powder dry for 2 weeks' time, but suffice to say, Jesus does not make the same mistake that the original rulers, Adam and Eve, did in the garden. As the template of a new humanity, a new human who will undo the mess, Jesus never comes out from under the rule of God, not once. And as a template of the new king, a king who will save his people, not just from a tyrant called Goliath, but a tyrant called sin, death, and separation from God, Jesus is that king. And he does it in the most unkingly manner possible. This is the whole tension of the Bible story. Through an unjust death as a criminal on a Roman cross. And what's the irony of the cross of Jesus? The sign above his head says, King of the Jews. And in our first clip today, we heard the young David saying to himself as he marched out to face Goliath, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me. A famous quote from a famous biblical hymn, Psalm 23, used the world over. And King David wrote many of the Psalms. Many of the hymn books, the hymns in the hymn book of Israel were written by King David, including Psalm 8, which is a song of praise to Israel's king, the Lord. And in it David says, as he looks up to God, What are humans that you take notice of them, God? Yet you have made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honour. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. Everybody ruling the world. Does it look that good? Everybody ruling the world. Well, the Bible doesn't think so either, in the way we're doing it. And that exact quote from Psalm 8 is quoted word for word in the New Testament letter, in the bit of the Bible that deals with Jesus coming, a book called Hebrews. And there the writer says, even if that is how humans should be, it's a mad world. We don't do it. We can't even control ourselves, never mind the whole creation. The writer says, we don't see it like that. But what do we see? And he goes on to say this, but we see Jesus, who for a little while was lower than the angels, crowned with glory and honour. Jesus ruling and reigning like humans should have. And why is he able to do this? Because the writer concludes that Jesus suffered and tasted death for the sake of everyone else. Everyone else who had come out from the rule and reign of God should, as David And Bathsheba had just said there, "Be cursed." But God, just as he did with David, shows grace. And Jesus, the King, dies in the place of the people. He goes out, the true champion, to fight the Philistine. Jesus served and saved his people. Jesus conquered the worst evil of all, death and separation from God. And every step of the way, he acknowledged that God is the true King. The Bible is leading us towards the fact that Jesus is the King that we need.